August 21st, 1938, Rosedale, Mississippi. A Sunday evening when the heat of the day was finally beginning to fade, but the air was still thick with humidity that made breathing feel like work, that made clothes stick to skin, that made everything move slower than it should. The First Baptist Church of Rosedale sat on a hill at the edge of town, a white wooden building with a tall steeple that could be seen from miles away across the flat delta landscape. The church had been built in 1889, almost 50 years earlier, by freed slaves and their children who wanted a place to worship that belonged to them, that represented their faith and their community, that stood as a testament to their survival and their determination to build something lasting, despite everything the world had thrown at them. The building was simple but well maintained, painted white every few years by volunteers from the congregation, the wooden pews inside polished smooth by decades of use, the floor swept clean after every service, the windows kept clear so light could stream in and illuminate the interior during daytime services. Behind the pulpit at the front of the church hung a large wooden cross, maybe 8 feet tall and 5 feet wide at the crossbeam, made from rough-hewn oak that had been cut from trees on the property when the church was first constructed. The cross had hung in that same spot for 49 years, mounted securely to the wall with iron brackets that had been forged by a blacksmith in the congregation, positioned so it was the first thing you saw when you walked through the front door and the last thing you saw when you left, a constant reminder of the sacrifice that formed the foundation of Christian faith, the symbol that connected this small church in Mississippi to believers around the world and across centuries. The cross was dark with age, the wood having absorbed decades of candle smoke and lamp oil and the accumulated prayers of thousands of services. It was heavy, solid, substantial, not something that could be moved easily or accidentally, not something that would shift or turn without deliberate human effort. On this particular Sunday evening, August 21st, 1938, the First Baptist Church of Rosedale was holding a special service. Not a regular Sunday service, which had already happened that morning, but an evening prayer meeting that had been organized by the church's youth group as a way to bring the community together, to raise money for repairs to the church roof that had been leaking during the last few rainstorms, to create an event that would appeal to people who might not normally attend regular services. The youth group had decided to make it a music-focused event, had invited several local musicians to come and play gospel songs, had spread the word throughout Rosedale and the surrounding areas that there would be singing and playing and fellowship and food, that everyone was welcome regardless of whether they were members of First Baptist or any church at all. By 6 o'clock that evening, 127 people had gathered inside the church. The pews were full. People were standing along the walls. Children were sitting on the floor in the spaces between pews. And the atmosphere was one of anticipation and community, and the particular warmth that comes from people gathering together for a shared purpose. The pastor of First Baptist Church was Reverend Samuel Washington, a man of 63 years who had been leading this congregation for the past 18 years and who was respected throughout Rosedale for his wisdom, his compassion, and his ability to preach sermons that spoke to both the mind and the heart, that challenged people to think while also comforting them in their struggles. Reverend Washington had organized the evening service with the help of the youth group, had reached out to musicians he knew in the area, had made sure there would be variety in the music so that different tastes would be represented, different styles honored, different expressions of faith given voice. Several musicians had already performed by the time Robert Johnson arrived around 7 o'clock. There had been a gospel quartet from Clarksdale that sang 4-part harmonies that made the walls of the church seem to vibrate with sound. There had been a woman with a voice like honey who sang "His Eye is on the Sparrow" and brought tears to the eyes of half the congregation. There had been a guitar player who did instrumental versions of hymns that were beautiful and technically impressive, The evening had been a success so far, the community was engaged and joyful, and Reverend Washington was pleased with how everything was going. When Robert Johnson walked through the door of First Baptist Church at 7 o'clock, carrying his guitar case, there was an immediate shift in the atmosphere. Not hostile exactly, but uncertain, wary, because Robert Johnson had a reputation. He was known throughout the Delta as a blues musician, someone who played in juke joints and at house parties, someone whose music was associated with drinking and dancing and all the activities that church people considered worldly, if not outright sinful. There were stories about Robert Johnson that circulated in both the secular and religious communities, stories about how he had gotten his talent, stories about deals and crossroads and prices paid for supernatural ability. Reverend Washington himself had mentioned Robert Johnson in sermons, not by name, but by implication, talking about the dangers of seeking worldly success through ungodly means, warning his congregation about music that came from dark places and could lead listeners astray. So seeing Robert Johnson walk into First Baptist Church during a gospel music event created confusion and concern among the 127 people present. Robert walked down the center aisle toward the front of the church, where Reverend Washington stood near the pulpit. He moved with the same quiet intensity he always carried, his thin frame seeming somehow both fragile and strong. His face showing the strain of constant travel and whatever inner burden he carried that made his eyes look older than his 27 years. He reached the front of the church and stood before Reverend Washington, and the two men looked at each other for a long moment while the congregation watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen, how this encounter between the respected pastor and the controversial musician would play out. Robert spoke first, his voice quiet but clear enough to be heard throughout the church. "Reverend Washington, I came to ask if I could play tonight. I know I'm not expected. I know I'm not exactly welcome, given what people say about me and my music. But I came to play gospel, not blues, not juke joint music. Gospel. The music I learned as a child before I started playing the other kind. The music I still remember, even though I don't play it much anymore. I came to play it here, in a church, for people who believe in what it represents, and I'm asking your permission." Reverend Washington studied Robert Johnson's face, looking for signs of mockery or insincerity, looking for indication that this was some kind of joke or performance or manipulation. But what he saw was earnestness, a genuine desire to do what he was asking to do, mixed with something that looked like desperation or need. Like this wasn't just a casual request, but something Robert felt compelled to do, something important to him in ways that might not be immediately obvious. Reverend Washington was silent for several seconds, aware that everyone in the church was watching this interaction, waiting to see how he would respond, aware that his decision would be judged and discussed and remembered. Finally he spoke. "Robert Johnson, I know your reputation. I know the kind of music you usually play and where you usually play it. I know the stories people tell about you, though I don't know how much of those stories is truth and how much is exaggeration or invention. But I also know that God's house is meant to be open to everyone who comes seeking Him. If you're here to play gospel music, to honor God through music, then I welcome you to do that. But I want to be clear, this is a sacred space. This is a house of worship. Whatever you play here needs to reflect that, needs to be respectful of the people gathered here and the faith we share. Can you do that?" Robert nodded. "Yes, sir. I can and I will. I'm here to play gospel, nothing else, just gospel. The songs I learned from my mother and my grandmother, the songs that talk about grace and redemption and the possibility of salvation, even for people who've wandered far from where they should be. That's what I want to play. That's what I need to play." Reverend Washington stepped aside, gestured toward the space in front of the pulpit where the other musicians had performed. "Then play. We'll listen, and we'll judge the music by what it is, not by what we've heard about the person playing it." Robert moved to the front of the church, opened his guitar case, pulled out his instrument. The congregation watched in silence. Some people curious, some skeptical, some actively hostile, convinced that allowing Robert Johnson to play in their church was a mistake, was inviting something unholy into a sacred space, was compromising the integrity of the evening and possibly endangering their souls. Robert took his time tuning the guitar, making small adjustments to each string, ensuring everything was perfect before he began, and then he started to play. The first song was Amazing Grace, one of the most beloved hymns in Christian tradition, written by John Newton in 1772, sung in churches around the world for more than a century and a half, a song about redemption and forgiveness and the transforming power of God's love. Robert played it slowly, reverently, his fingers picking out the melody on the guitar strings, while he sang the familiar words in a voice that was different from his blues voice. Gentler somehow, more vulnerable, stripped of the roughness and edge that characterized his secular music. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. His voice filled the church, clear and strong, and carrying genuine emotion, genuine feeling, not performance but prayer, not entertainment but worship. The congregation listened in surprise, many of them not expecting Robert Johnson to be capable of this kind of music, not expecting him to play gospel with such skill and such apparent sincerity. And behind him, on the wall above and behind the pulpit, the large wooden cross that had hung in the same position for 49 years began to move. Not dramatically at first, not in a way that was immediately obvious to everyone in the church. But it moved, started to rotate slowly on the iron brackets that held it to the wall, turning clockwise, degree by degree, so gradually that you had to be watching carefully to notice it happening. A woman named Martha Johnson was sitting in the third row on the left side of the church, positioned where she had a clear view of both Robert Johnson playing in front of the pulpit and the cross hanging on the wall behind him. Martha was 58 years old, had been a member of First Baptist Church for 32 years, had sat in that same general area for thousands of services over those 3 decades, and she knew every detail of the church's interior, knew exactly how things should look, knew the position of that cross as well as she knew the position of furniture in her own home. So when the cross started to move, even though the movement was subtle and slow, Martha noticed immediately. She stared at the cross, trying to understand what she was seeing, trying to determine if it was really moving or if her eyes were playing tricks on her, if the lighting in the church was creating an illusion of movement where none actually existed. But no, it was definitely moving. She could see it clearly now, could see the cross rotating slowly clockwise, could see the bottom of the vertical beam shifting position relative to the wall behind it. Martha's first thought was that the brackets holding the cross had come loose, that the cross was falling or sliding down the wall due to some structural failure, but that didn't match what she was seeing. The cross wasn't falling. It was rotating, turning around its center point as if someone were physically rotating it, as if invisible hands were gripping it and deliberately turning it. Martha opened her mouth to say something, to alert others to what was happening, but no sound came out. She was too shocked, too confused, too unable to process the impossible thing she was witnessing. A man named James Foster, sitting 2 rows behind Martha on the right side of the church, noticed the movement next. James was 44 years old, worked as a carpenter in Rosedale, had actually helped repair the church building on several occasions over the years, and was familiar with how it was constructed, how things were mounted and secured. He saw the cross moving, and his carpenter's mind immediately started analyzing what could cause that, what structural issue or mechanical failure would result in a heavy wooden cross rotating on its mounting brackets. But he couldn't think of any explanation that made sense. The brackets were solid iron, were bolted directly into the wall studs, were designed to hold the cross firmly in place without any possibility of rotation. And yet, the cross was definitely rotating. James could see it clearly now, as the movement became more pronounced, as the rotations sped up slightly, as what had been subtle and easy to miss became obvious and undeniable. More people started to notice as the rotation continued. A child sitting on the floor pointed at the cross and said loudly, "Mama, why is the cross moving?" The mother shushed the child automatically, but then looked up and saw what her daughter was pointing at and gasped. An elderly man in the back row stood up to get a better view, squinted at the cross, then sat down heavily and gripped the pew in front of him. A woman in the choir loft on the left side of the church stopped singing along with Robert's music and grabbed the arm of the person next to her, pointed at the cross without speaking, her face showing fear and confusion. The movement was undeniable now. The cross had rotated maybe 20 degrees from its original position, and the rotation was continuing, steady and inexorable. The heavy wooden cross turning on its iron brackets as if the laws of physics that should keep it stationary had been temporarily suspended. Robert Johnson continued playing Amazing Grace, seemingly unaware of what was happening behind him, or perhaps aware but choosing not to acknowledge it, focused entirely on his music, on the words he was singing, on the prayer he was offering through his performance. He had his eyes closed during parts of the song, his head tilted back slightly, his whole body engaged in the act of making music, of worship, of whatever complicated mixture of devotion and desperation had brought him to this church on this evening. The cross continued to rotate, 30 degrees now, 45 degrees. The congregation was no longer listening to the music. Everyone was watching the cross, stunned into silence, unable to look away from the impossible thing happening in front of them. Some people were frightened, gripping the hands of family members beside them, breathing fast and shallow. Some were confused, trying to understand what could possibly cause this, what rational explanation existed for a heavy wooden cross rotating on wall brackets that should hold it completely still. Some were starting to connect the movement of the cross to Robert Johnson's presence, to his music, to the stories about him that they had heard and half believed, to the possibility that something supernatural was happening in their church. Reverend Washington stood frozen near the pulpit, watching the cross rotate, his mind racing. As the spiritual leader of this congregation, he needed to do something, needed to respond to this situation in some way. But what? Stop Robert from playing? Demand that he leave the church? Try to physically stop the cross from rotating? Pray? Call on God to intervene? He didn't know. Had never been trained for a situation like this, had never imagined he would face something like this, had no framework for understanding what was happening or how to respond to it. The cross continued its rotation. 60 degrees, 75 degrees, 90 degrees. It had now rotated a full quarter turn from its original position, the vertical beam now horizontal, the horizontal beam now vertical, the entire symbol inverted from how it should be, transformed into something that looked wrong, that violated the fundamental geometry of the cross as it had been designed and as it had hung in this church for 49 years. People in the congregation began to react more vocally now. A woman toward the back said, "Lord, have mercy," in a voice that shook with fear. A man stood up and said loudly, "Reverend, you need to stop this. This ain't right. This ain't natural. You need to make him stop playing." Several children started crying, picking up on the fear of the adults around them, sensing that something was very wrong, even if they didn't fully understand what. A few people stood up and moved toward the doors, wanting to leave, wanting to get out of the church, wanting to distance themselves from whatever was happening. But most people stayed in their seats, unable to move, transfixed by the rotating cross, by the impossible thing occurring in their sacred space. The cross continued to rotate past 90 degrees, 100 degrees, 120 degrees, 150 degrees. Robert Johnson finished Amazing Grace and transitioned smoothly into another gospel song without pause, without opening his eyes, without acknowledging the chaos growing in the congregation behind him. The second song was Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, another beloved hymn, another song about deliverance and salvation, another prayer set to music. His playing was beautiful, technically perfect, emotionally genuine, exactly what gospel music should be. But the context had been completely transformed by what was happening with the cross. What should have been a moment of worship had become something else entirely, something that felt dangerous and wrong and frightening. The cross reached 180 degrees, fully inverted now, completely upside down. The base of the vertical beam pointing toward the ceiling, the top of the vertical beam pointing toward the floor, the horizontal crossbeam oriented correctly, but the whole symbol reversed, turned into its own opposite, transformed from a symbol of salvation into something that looked like its negation. And there it stopped. The rotation that had been steady and continuous for the past several minutes ceased. The cross hung upside down on the wall behind the pulpit, motionless now, as if this inverted position was its natural state, as if it had always been this way, and the previous 49 years of being right side up had been the aberration. The church was in chaos now. People were shouting, crying, praying, some calling on God to protect them, others demanding that Reverend Washington do something, others simply expressing their fear and confusion in voices that rose and overlapped and created a cacophony that filled the building. Reverend Washington found his voice. "Robert Johnson, stop playing, stop right now." His voice was loud enough to cut through the noise, commanding enough that Robert heard and responded, his fingers stilling on the guitar strings, the music cutting off mid-phrase, leaving sudden silence in its wake, except for the continued cries and prayers of the frightened congregation. Robert opened his eyes, lowered his guitar, and turned around to look at the wall behind him. When he saw the inverted cross hanging there, his face showed no surprise. Just a deep sadness, a weariness, a look of resignation that suggested he had expected something like this, had perhaps known it would happen, had maybe even experienced similar things before. He turned back to face Reverend Washington and the congregation, and his voice when he spoke was quiet and defeated. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. Or maybe I did mean for it and just didn't want to admit it to myself. I don't know anymore. I came here to play gospel, came here hoping that maybe if I played sacred music in a sacred place, things would be different. But I guess I was wrong." He gestured at the inverted cross without looking at it. "This is what happens now, started a few months ago. Wherever I play, especially if I try to play gospel or anything religious, crosses turn, symbols change. Sacred things respond to my presence in ways that make it clear I'm not welcome, that I've become something that holy objects reject. I don't know how to stop it. Don't know how to fix it. Don't know if it can be fixed or if this is just how things are now and will be until..." He trailed off. Didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what he meant. Until he died. Until whatever time he had left ran out. Until the price for whatever bargain he had made was fully paid. Reverend Washington looked at Robert Johnson, looked at the inverted cross on the wall, looked at his congregation that was frightened and confused, and looking to him for guidance, for explanation, for some way to make sense of what they had all witnessed. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, trying to think clearly despite the shock and fear he felt, trying to be the spiritual leader his congregation needed him to be in this moment. "Robert Johnson, I think you need to leave." Reverend Washington's voice was firm, but not cruel, not condemning, but not welcoming either. "I let you play here because you asked, and because I believe God's house should be open to those who seek Him. But what's happened here, what we've all witnessed, suggests that your presence is causing things to occur that are harmful to this community of faith. I don't claim to understand why. I don't claim to know what you've done or what's been done to you, but that cross has hung in this church for 49 years without moving, and in the few minutes you've been playing, it's turned completely upside down. That can't be coincidence, that means something. And I don't think that something is good. Robert nodded slowly, accepting the judgment, not arguing or defending himself. He placed his guitar back in its case, closed the latches carefully, picked up the case by its handle. I understand, Reverend. I'll go. I'm sorry for the disruption, sorry for frightening people. That wasn't my intention. I just wanted to play gospel one more time in a real church. Wanted to remember what it felt like to make music for God instead of for other purposes. But I guess that's not possible for me anymore. Guess I gave up that right when I made my choice. He walked down the center aisle toward the door, moving slowly, head down, the picture of defeat and resignation. The congregation parted before him, people pulling back from the aisle, not wanting to be too close to him, as if whatever had caused the cross to invert might be contagious, might transfer to them through proximity or contact. A few people looked at him with pity as he passed, seeing not a monster or a demon, but a sad, broken man carrying a burden too heavy for any person to bear. Most looked at him with fear or disgust or anger, seeing someone who had brought something evil into their church, who had defiled their sacred space, who represented everything they had been taught to reject and avoid. Robert reached the door, paused for a moment with his hand on the handle, looked back at the congregation one final time. I hope you all can fix the cross. Hope it goes back to normal once I'm gone. If it doesn't, I'm truly sorry. Add it to the list of things I'm sorry for. List gets longer every day. Then he was gone, pushing through the door and into the evening, leaving behind 127 witnesses to an impossible event. For several seconds after Robert left, nobody in the church moved or spoke. Everyone stared at the inverted cross hanging on the wall, trying to process what had happened, trying to understand, trying to reconcile what they had seen with their understanding of how the world worked. Then Reverend Washington spoke, his voice shaking slightly but still carrying authority. James Foster, Samuel Green, Marcus Williams, come with me. We're going to try to turn that cross back to its proper position. Everyone else, please stay in your seats and pray. Pray for understanding. Pray for protection. Pray for that young man who just left, because whatever burden he's carrying is clearly terrible and he needs our prayers whether he deserves them or not. 3 men stood up from the congregation and made their way to the front of the church. James Foster the carpenter, Samuel Green, who was a large man who worked loading cotton bales and had the strength to move heavy objects, and Marcus Williams, who was a deacon in the church and felt it was his responsibility to help address this situation. The 4 men stood before the inverted cross, looking up at it, trying to figure out how to approach this task. James Foster, with his carpenter's expertise, examined the cross carefully before touching it. The brackets look fine, he said. They're not loose or damaged. The cross is still mounted securely. It shouldn't have been able to rotate at all, let alone rotate smoothly like we all just watched it do. But since it did rotate, I'm assuming we should be able to rotate it back. He reached up and gripped the horizontal beam, which was now oriented vertically, and tried to push it. The cross didn't move. He tried again, pushing harder, putting real force into it. Still nothing. The cross remained inverted, as immovable as if it had been welded in place. Samuel Green joined him, adding his considerable strength to the effort. 2 grown men pushing on the cross with all their force, and it didn't budge even slightly. Marcus Williams and Reverend Washington added their hands, all 4 men now pushing together, grunting with effort, straining to rotate the cross back to its original position. It remained perfectly still, completely resistant to their efforts, as if it weighed 1,000 pounds, or as if it had been supernaturally fixed in this inverted position. The congregation watched this futile effort, their fear growing as it became clear that the cross could not be moved by normal human strength, that whatever force had rotated it had also locked it in place, that the inversion was not temporary but apparently permanent. After several minutes of trying, the 4 men gave up, breathing hard from exertion, sweating despite the cooling evening air, frustrated and frightened by their inability to accomplish something that should have been relatively simple. James Foster spoke to the congregation, explaining what they had all witnessed. The cross won't move. Can't move it even with 4 of us pushing as hard as we can. It turned easy as anything when Robert Johnson was playing, just rotated smooth like it was on ball bearings. But now it's like it's fixed in place, like it's part of the wall itself. I don't understand it. In all my years as a carpenter, in all my understanding of how things are built and how they work, I got no explanation for this. Reverend Washington addressed the congregation, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility and uncertainty. What we've witnessed tonight is beyond my ability to fully explain or understand. A cross that has hung in this church for 49 years, a cross that has been a symbol of our faith and our community for longer than most of us have been alive, has been inverted through means I cannot explain by natural law or physical force. It happened in the presence of Robert Johnson while he played gospel music. When he left and we tried to restore the cross to its proper position, we found we could not. 4 strong men could not move it even slightly. This suggests that what happened was not a trick or an illusion or a mechanical failure, but something else entirely, something supernatural. Something that challenges our understanding of how the world works. He paused, looking out at the frightened faces of his congregation, seeing fear and confusion and the need for guidance, for reassurance, for some framework that would help them make sense of what they had experienced. I want us all to remember something important. The cross, whether right side up or upside down, is a symbol. It represents Christ's sacrifice, his death and resurrection, the foundation of our faith. But it is not itself sacred. It is wood and iron, material objects that we have imbued with meaning. The inversion of this symbol is disturbing, is frightening, appears to suggest the presence of evil, or at least the absence of good. But our faith is not in the symbol. Our faith is in what the symbol represents. And that cannot be inverted or damaged or destroyed by any force, natural or supernatural. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. His sacrifice is real and complete and sufficient, regardless of how a wooden cross in a church in Mississippi is oriented. So while we should take seriously what happened here tonight, while we should seek to understand it and respond to it appropriately, we should not let it shake the foundation of our faith. The congregation listened, some people taking comfort in Reverend Washington's words, others still too frightened and confused to be easily reassured. Reverend Washington continued, "We will leave the cross as it is for now. We cannot move it by physical force, and I don't think we should try to remove it or destroy it. It has been part of this church for nearly 50 years. Instead, we will pray over it. We will ask God to restore it if that is His will, or to give us understanding of why this has happened and what we should learn from it. And we will remember that we are witnesses to something unexplained, something that challenges our comfortable assumptions about how the world works, and that our response should be humble acknowledgement of mystery rather than fearful rejection of what we don't understand." He led the congregation in prayer, his voice strong and steady despite the trembling in his hands, asking God for wisdom and understanding and protection, asking for restoration of the cross if possible, asking for peace for the 127 people who had witnessed this impossible event. After the prayer, the service was concluded. There was no more music, no more fellowship, no more of the joyful community gathering that the evening had been before Robert Johnson arrived. People filed out of the church in silence, shocked and subdued, leaving in family groups or alone, heading to their homes where they would try to process what they had seen, try to explain it to family members who hadn't been there, try to sleep despite the images and questions that would haunt them. As the church emptied, Reverend Washington remained inside with the 3 men who had tried to move the cross. They stood together looking up at the inverted symbol, trying to make sense of it, trying to decide what should be done. Should we take it down? Marcus Williams asked. Remove it completely if we can't turn it back? Seems wrong to leave a cross hanging upside down in God's house. James Foster shook his head. I don't think we can remove it any easier than we could turn it. And even if we could, I'm not sure we should. This happened for a reason. Don't know what that reason is, but it means something. Maybe we're supposed to leave it as a reminder, as a warning, as evidence that the spiritual realm is real and active and sometimes manifests in ways we don't expect and can't control. Reverend Washington nodded slowly. I think James is right. We leave it. We pray over it. We see if it changes over time, if God restores it, or if it remains inverted. And we tell the story of what happened here tonight. We tell it accurately, without exaggeration, but also without minimizing how impossible and frightening it was. We tell it as a testimony to the reality of forces beyond our understanding and the importance of being cautious about the choices we make and the paths we follow. The inverted cross remained on the wall of First Baptist Church of Rosedale for 3 weeks. During that time, people came from throughout the area to see it, to verify that the story was true, that a cross really had turned upside down during a performance by Robert Johnson and could not be turned back. The church was open during daytime hours to allow visitors, and Reverend Washington, or one of the deacons, was always present to tell the story of what had happened, to answer questions, to provide context. The story spread throughout Mississippi and beyond, adding to the legend of Robert Johnson, providing more evidence that his talent came from unnatural sources, that his presence caused sacred objects to respond in ways that suggested divine rejection or demonic influence. Some people who came to see the cross were believers who wanted confirmation of the supernatural. Others were skeptics who thought there must be a rational explanation and wanted to examine the cross and the mounting brackets to find evidence of trickery or mechanical failure. But no one found any such evidence. The cross remained inverted, immovable, inexplicable. Then, on September 12, 1938, 3 weeks after the event and 1 month after Robert Johnson's death on August 16th, Reverend Washington arrived at the church early in the morning to prepare for Sunday service and found that the cross had returned to its original position. Overnight, without human intervention, the cross had rotated back to being right side up. The vertical beam once again pointed toward heaven and earth in the traditional orientation. The horizontal crossbeam once again extended left and right in the familiar configuration. The symbol was restored, returned to how it had been for 49 years before Robert Johnson played gospel in the sanctuary. Reverend Washington stood before the cross in wonder and relief, thanking God for this restoration, whether it had been accomplished through divine intervention or through the removal of whatever force had inverted it in the first place. He told the congregation that morning about the cross's return to its proper position, and many people took it as a sign that Robert Johnson's death had broken whatever curse or influence had affected the sacred symbol, that his passing had released the church from the supernatural effect of his presence. The 127 people who had been in First Baptist Church on the evening of August 21st, 1938, became known in Rosedale and the surrounding area as the witnesses to the inverted cross. They were sought out by others who wanted to hear the story directly, who wanted confirmation, who wanted details. Their testimonies were remarkably consistent. All 127 described watching the cross begin to rotate while Robert Johnson played gospel music. All described the rotation as smooth and continuous, not jerky or hesitant, as if the cross was being turned by invisible hands. All described the cross completing a full 180-degree rotation until it was completely upside down. All described the cross stopping in that inverted position and remaining there despite the efforts of 4 strong men to turn it back. All described the fear and confusion that gripped the congregation, the sense that they were witnessing something that shouldn't be possible, that violated natural law and suggested the presence of supernatural forces. Among those 127 witnesses were people from all walks of life, all ages, all levels of education and sophistication. There were farmers and teachers, laborers and business owners, children and elderly people, those with deep faith and those with more casual religious affiliation. The diversity of the witnesses made their consistent testimony more credible, made it harder to dismiss as mass hysteria or shared delusion or coordinated deception. These were not people with a reason to lie or a desire to promote Robert Johnson's legend. Many of them were frightened by what they had seen and wished it hadn't happened. But they all testified to the same basic facts because those facts were what they had experienced, what they had seen with their own eyes, what they could not deny even if they couldn't explain. Martha Johnson, the woman who had first noticed the cross beginning to move, was interviewed in 1954, 16 years after the event. She was 74 years old by then, had lived through a lot in those 16 years, had seen a lot of strange and difficult things. But when asked about the night the cross inverted in First Baptist Church, her memory was vivid and detailed. "I saw it start to move," she said in the recorded interview. "Saw it when it was just beginning, when most people hadn't noticed yet. I know that church inside and out, know every detail of how it looks, and I could see the cross rotating, even when the movement was subtle. At first I thought maybe the brackets had come loose, maybe it was falling, but it wasn't falling, it was turning. Deliberate and smooth, like someone was rotating it on purpose, and it kept turning while Robert Johnson played, kept rotating until it was completely upside down. And I know what people say about mass hysteria, about groups of people convincing themselves they saw something that didn't really happen, but I was there. I saw it with my own eyes, and it was real." James Foster, the carpenter who had tried to turn the cross back to its proper position, was interviewed multiple times over the years about what he had experienced. In a 1961 interview, he spoke about the impossibility of what he had witnessed from a technical perspective. "I build things for a living, have been for 30 years. I understand how structures work, how things are mounted and supported, how weight and leverage and force interact. That cross was mounted on solid iron brackets bolted into wall studs. It shouldn't have been able to rotate at all. The brackets didn't allow for rotation. They were designed to hold the cross in one fixed position. For it to rotate the way it did, smoothly and continuously, the brackets themselves would have had to rotate, which they're not designed to do, and which would have required the bolts holding them to the wall to loosen simultaneously, which doesn't happen. And then when we tried to turn it back, we couldn't move it at all. 4 of us pushing with all our strength, and it might as well have been welded to the wall. I got no explanation for that. None that makes sense according to physics and engineering and everything I know about how the physical world works." Reverend Washington spoke about that evening many times in the remaining years of his ministry before he retired in 1952. In sermons and in private conversations and in formal interviews, he returned again and again to the question of what it meant, what they were supposed to learn from witnessing something so impossible and so disturbing. In a 1948 interview, he said, "I've thought about that night a lot in the 10 years since it happened, thought about what it means that Robert Johnson's gospel music caused a cross to invert. Some people say it proves he was in league with the devil, that even his attempt to play sacred music was tainted by whatever bargain he had made. Others say it proves that sacred symbols respond to spiritual realities, that the cross was reflecting some truth about Robert Johnson's spiritual state that wasn't visible to the naked eye. I don't know which interpretation is correct. Maybe both have some truth, maybe neither captures the full reality. What I do know is that we witnessed something that shouldn't be possible according to natural law, and that should make us humble. Should make us acknowledge that there are forces and realities beyond what we can see and measure and understand. Should make us take seriously the spiritual dimension of existence and the choices we make that affect our standing in that dimension. The story of the inverted cross became one of the most well-documented supernatural events associated with Robert Johnson, and one of the most theologically significant. While other stories about him involved blues music and juke joints and secular settings, this one involved gospel music and a church and explicitly religious symbolism. The fact that Robert's attempt to play sacred music in a sacred space resulted in a sacred symbol being inverted suggested something profound about his spiritual condition, about the permanence and consequences of whatever choice or bargain he had made. It suggested that there were boundaries that had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, doors that had been opened that couldn't be closed, changes that had been made to his fundamental nature that couldn't be undone, even by sincere attempts at redemption or worship. The theological implications troubled many church people who heard the story. If Robert Johnson's gospel music caused crosses to invert, did that mean he was beyond salvation? Did it mean that his attempt to worship was rejected by God? Did it mean that some sins or some bargains create permanent spiritual damage that precludes the possibility of redemption? These were uncomfortable questions that challenged the doctrine of universal availability of grace, that suggested limits to God's mercy, that implied some people might be truly and permanently lost regardless of their desire for salvation. Different churches and different denominations answered these questions in different ways, but all had to grapple with the implications of a story that suggested sacred symbols could physically reject the worship of certain individuals. Skeptics tried to find natural explanations for what had happened. Some suggested that the iron brackets holding the cross had rusted or degraded over 49 years and had finally failed during Robert Johnson's performance, a coincidence of timing rather than a supernatural event. But this didn't explain why the cross rotated smoothly rather than falling, why it rotated exactly 180 degrees and then stopped, or why it couldn't be rotated back by physical force. Some suggested that Robert Johnson had arranged for the cross to be loosened beforehand as part of an elaborate performance, that he had rigged it to rotate during his playing to enhance his reputation for supernatural connections. But Robert had arrived at the church unannounced, had no opportunity to tamper with the cross beforehand, and showed no sign of having expected or planned what happened. His request to play and Reverend Washington's decision to allow it were spontaneous, not prearranged. Some suggested that the 127 witnesses had experienced a shared hallucination, that the combination of religious fervor and Robert Johnson's reputation and the emotionally charged atmosphere of the evening had created conditions where people saw what they expected to see rather than what actually happened. But this didn't account for the consistency of testimony across 127 different people with different expectations and different levels of religious commitment. It didn't account for the fact that the cross remained inverted for 3 weeks afterward, visible to anyone who came to see it, photographed and examined and verified by people who had not been present during the original event. It didn't account for the physical evidence that the cross could not be moved by normal human strength after it had inverted. Every natural explanation had significant problems, left too many facts unexplained, required too many unlikely coincidences or implausible assumptions, which left the supernatural explanation as the most coherent account of what had happened, even though it required accepting something that violated natural law and challenged materialist assumptions about how reality operates. Robert Johnson died less than a month after the incident at First Baptist Church in Rosedale. He was 27 years old. In the brief time between August 21st, when the cross inverted, and August 16th, when he died, Robert apparently spoke to a few people about what had happened that night. According to second-hand accounts that came to light later, Robert said that he had hoped playing gospel in a church would somehow break or reverse whatever bargain he had made, that returning to the music of his childhood and performing it in a sacred space would restore him to a state of grace, would undo the consequences of his choice to pursue blues mastery through whatever means he had employed. The inversion of the cross had destroyed that hope, had made clear that there was no return path available to him, that the changes made were permanent and irreversible. He apparently told one person, "I thought maybe if I played for God instead of for the devil, things would change. Thought maybe it wasn't too late." But that cross turning upside down, that was an answer. That was God saying, "I'm not welcome in his house anymore, that I made my choice, and now I got to live with it or die with it," which is what's about to happen. The connection between the inverted cross on August 21st and Robert's death on August 16th, less than a month later, has been noted by many people who study his life and legend. Some see it as evidence that the cross inversion was a warning of his impending death, a sign that his time was running out, a physical manifestation of spiritual rejection that presaged his physical death. Some see it as the final proof that Robert had indeed made a supernatural bargain and that the time for payment had arrived, that the inversion of the cross during his gospel performance was the rejection of his last attempt to escape the consequences of that bargain. Some see it as tragic, the story of a man who had made a terrible mistake and sought redemption, but found that redemption was no longer available to him, that he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The cross at First Baptist Church of Rosedale was eventually replaced in 1955, 17 years after the incident. Not because there was anything wrong with it structurally, not because it had been damaged by the inversion or the subsequent return to normal position, but because the congregation felt that it carried too much weight of memory, too much association with that disturbing evening, too much reminder of things they would rather not constantly confront. The old cross was removed carefully, stored in a back room of the church for several years, and eventually given to a museum that collected artifacts related to Delta blues history and Robert Johnson's legend. It's on display now, accompanied by a placard that tells the story of August 21st, 1938, when it inverted during Robert Johnson's gospel performance and could not be turned back until after his death. Visitors to the museum can see the cross, can examine it, can touch the wood and the iron brackets, and verify that it's a normal physical object with no obvious mechanical features that would allow it to rotate. And they can read the testimonies of some of the 127 witnesses who saw it turn upside down, and who maintained until their deaths that what they witnessed was real and inexplicable and deeply disturbing. The story endures because it's well documented, because it has numerous credible witnesses, because it involves a physical object that still exists and can be examined, because it raises profound questions about the nature of spiritual reality and the consequences of the choices we make. Whether you interpret it as evidence of Robert Johnson's damnation, or as evidence of the reality of supernatural forces, or as evidence of something else entirely, depends on your worldview and your willingness to accept that the material world might not be all that exists. But regardless of interpretation, the facts remain. 127 people witnessed a wooden cross invert itself during Robert Johnson's gospel performance. 4 strong men could not turn it back. It remained inverted for 3 weeks, then restored itself after Robert's death. These are documented historical facts, testified to by numerous witnesses, supported by physical evidence, recorded in church records and personal accounts, and later journalistic investigations. Something happened that night in Rosedale, Mississippi. Something impossible. Something that 127 people saw and never forgot and couldn't explain, no matter how many years passed or how many times they told the story. This is the story of August 21st, 1938, when Robert Johnson walked into a church to play gospel music, and a cross that had hung in that church for 49 years inverted itself and remained inverted until after his death. The story of 127 witnesses to an impossible event. The story of a man seeking redemption and finding rejection. The story of a sacred symbol responding to a spiritual reality in a way that challenged everyone's assumptions about how the world works and what's truly possible in it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for considering this testimony from people who were there, who saw it, who carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives. Whether you believe it was supernatural or whether you think there must be some natural explanation that hasn't been found yet, the witnesses were clear and consistent. They saw what they saw, and what they saw changed how they understood the world and the forces that operate within it, seen and unseen, natural and supernatural, material and spiritual. The cross turned upside down. 127 people watched it happen, and nothing was ever quite the same for any of them after that night.